the very wide topic that you all have given me, which is, the entire aviation sector and its economic underpinnings. I don't think we should get into that in too much of detail, but I will try to focus on some key areas and try to provide to the students from a law perspective as well, apart from the economics of it all, some useful insights which they can then bite into. Let me start by just sharing some shocking numbers, which is on the aviation penetration of India. So I joined the ministry 4.5 years ago, or rather I served in the ministry for 4 years, and that was my first experience with civil aviation. And I just happily asked the question, what is the aviation penetration of India? And the year was 2016-17 or 17-18. And I got a reply that we don't know. So I set about trying to find out as to what India is all about. And I discovered that as compared to even other developing country markets like Brazil or Turkey or Indonesia or China, what to speak of the US and Norway, our aviation penetration was quite low. So if we look at domestic air passengers as a percentage of total population, we were at about 4.7% in 2013-14. But by the time we came to 2018-19, it had increased to 10.2%. Note the hefty increase, because this was actually a period of very rapid and unprecedented aviation growth. Air travel penetration rate, and I take the domestic one. I'm just giving, just 4 numbers I'm going to give to the students, or 4 markers I'm going to give to the students so that they can, in future, develop them as the 4 pillars or the foundation from which they must gauge the growth of the aviation sector. So air travel penetration rate, which is usually the annual domestic carriers seats per capita. So it's how much installed capacity in terms of seats you have, which can be offered to passengers on an annual basis. It was only 7.2% in 2013. And by the time we reached 2018, it was 12.4%. Now, if you look at Norway, etc., they were at a huge 47%, etc. So, that's the kind of gap that we had on the air travel penetration rate. International was much lower. This is the domestic one. If we look at contribution to GDP, which is, again, another very important marker, India contributed direct aviation GDP was 0.5%. And if you add the direct, the indirect, and the catalytic GDP impact on GDP, then it was 1.1%. Or rather, if we want to put numbers to it, it's about $32 billion US. And the total global aviation GDP that we have is about 3 trillion. Okay, so that's the kind of penetration that we had in terms of contribution to aviation GDP to total GDP. India held, but if you look at jobs, I heard the question on jobs as well. India held 4%. Now you remember, GDP was 0.5%, but India held 4% of global direct aviation jobs. And another number, which is very telling, is the global jobs that were generated, 12% of them were in India after you add the catalytic impact of the tourism sector, with which aviation is intrinsically linked. So this is the kind of background from which you have to look at India's aviation. Now let's see. When we studied further, we found that Indian aviation was both resilient and promising. What do I mean by that? What were the markers that we were beginning to look at? You look at passenger traffic, you look at regional connectivity, because it can't be overall numbers, there could be regional variations. Air cargo and logistics. Do we have global hubs in India? Do we provide the milk runs for cargo, the east-west runs that we normally see from Asia to Europe or the US, which is the east-west milk runs, the daily movement of cargo? Did India contribute to it? Hardly at all. So it was basically India's cargo, which was moving out, or India was importing cargo. Of course, perishables and pharma, these are two very important exports, and we were doing pretty well in that. And we improved it further through specific measures as well. Airport capacity, did we have it? Airport quality, we have been operationalizing non-operational airports. We have been monetizing the tier 2 and tier 3 airports. These are all bids to improve the overall ecosystem. We have scheduled and non-scheduled aircraft fleet. I'm sure the numbers can come to you in the course of the discussions. But dedicated freighters, we didn't have them. Air India had 4 dedicated air freighters, but they were not in use because they were being used for other purposes, or they needed maintenance. And it is in 2018, after we put in a very important surge and a new air cargo policy for the first time as a standalone policy, that we started seeing the air freighters, the dedicated freighters, being developed by being bought or taken on lease and being run by our scheduled operators. SpiceJet was the first one to go with 5 freighters. And, during COVID, I'll talk about that. They were literally the lifeline in providing the essential goods movements, the medicines movements, the vaccine movements, and so on and so forth. And thank God we moved for a very good national air cargo policy, which enabled our airlines to lease dedicated freighters. Then air navigation and air traffic management. Amber did speak a little bit about the traffic management in the context of drones. Well, you do it in the context of planes also. There's a huge safety and security angle to it, and that is something that guides the whole thing. Civil MRO, in India, we did have the Air India's wholly owned subsidiary, which was providing about 85% of the entire MRO that was sourced domestically by the Indian Airlines. And the other private players, Airworks, etc., were providing the balance 15%. But in overall terms, if you look at it, India was sourcing practically 90% of its total MRO needs from abroad. So it was mainly line maintenance, which is a very quick check, etc., which is done here, was being done in India. And very swiftly we moved. I was handling the MRO portfolio. We came out with MRO policy, etc., tried to see how we could bring tax breaks. These were very important tax breaks, which got announced by in the union budget for 2019-20 and 2020-21. And I hope that going forward, we will see a huge amount of difference. We also worked, I was chairing the group, and it was conceptualized by us, of convergence of MRO between civil and defense MRO. So that is something that we took up again in a very strong way. About 20% of the defense fleet is non-weaponized fleet. You have the transport planes and so on. So it was easy to try to see how we could have more economies of scale so that the defense MRO could be done at our civil commercial MRO stations, organizations as well. A lot is there about inputs into providing aviation services and the fuel, ATF, and all the taxes associated, not just with ATF, but also the newly introduced GST. That was again my dossier. I had just joined in May 2017, and 1st of July, the new GST Act had come in. And from aviation, we had to take up a huge number of tax changes, which inadvertently were causing an excessive taxation on different aspects of the aviation sector. So we needed to take that up at breakneck speed. And thankfully, we found a very good audience in the Ministry of Finance and the GST Council. Ground handling and allied aviation services. This is another very important component. Why am I talking about all these components? It's simply because in the entire value chain, you must be able to ensure that every rung, every link is strong, because you know the adage that any chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So if ground handling or any other MRO is weak, or manufacturing is weak from the very beginning, or the sourcing of inputs or components is weak, then obviously the services delivery will have the added cost. Because, you know, the अर्जुन को जो मच्छी की आंख नजर आई थी, जिसमें तीर मारा था, and he was successful because he focused on the arc, is basically the transaction cost to the consumer, or rather freight rate in the case of cargo and passenger tickets in the case of passenger services. Everything else is, you know, part of the links that go back. And so we have to, in determining the health of the aviation sector, always be very sure that we are ensuring that this cost plus regime is addressed, and the final price or the freight or the cost to the airline, which is providing the delivery of service, whether the air transport service, whether it's passenger or freight, that is affordable and it is competitive. Both factors have to be taken into account. That's why if you look at in India, we have basically two models which are going. One is the scheduled operations and the non-scheduled operations, which are operating in a competitive pricing regime, and it's a competitively determined market price. Whereas if you look at the Udan scheme, and also subsequently for cargo, the Krishi Udan scheme, for instance, that is based on affordability. So it has a notion of how to remove the impediments, the cost impediments in providing services to disadvantaged areas or to people who would otherwise not use air transport services. Drones, it was another ecosystem which needed to be developed, and Amber has spoken enough on it, so let me not say anything. I will just add to one comment. You know, Amber was a little diffident in answering as to why on the issue of the WTO compliance of the ban on drones. I've done WTO negotiations for Government of India, including at the Permanent Mission of India to the WTO at Geneva. A total period of 12 years of my life I've spent on it. So the justification is to be found in security. It's also to be found in public health and public safety, because we find that where drones are concerned, if you're importing a full one, it's very difficult to examine at the border itself and to be completely sanguine that the drone does not have a danger. It does not pose a threat or a danger to the public at large or the user. So it's government is within its rights to use these exceptions for putting restrictions until it can put in place a system which is has the requisite level of protection. I'm not saying you can ever have a completely foolproof system, but where the level of protection to the public at large is sufficient for it to remove the ban. Then where aviation sector, coming back to it more generally, is concerned, you have consumer satisfaction and grievances redressal performance. We took care of service level standards. Quality was such an important thing. We brought in quality metrics, not just for airports, for cargo, for different levels of services delivery. So these service level standards were set. We went for single window and automated approvals, the EGCA, ESAHAJ, et cetera. And one of the areas which has, from my very intervention, first statement, R&D and modern technology, artificial intelligence, digitalization, these are all what I would say necessary coins in our pocket, in our aviation pocket. So this is something that we don't have a choice in the matter. Although I speak of R&D, it does not, most of the times we think it's something to be done in a laboratory, but I think in law schools as well, a lot of research and development can go into the laws that we draft, or how they are to be implemented, and what's the best way to adapt to the processes. Because after all, you have the physical, the goods or the equipment, the manufacturing side, then you have the financial overlayer, and then you have the soft skills, which include not just technology or the software, but also the legal systems or the services delivery. So I think all the three layers have to work in a very creative way. Many of the times, and this is not a criticism, I've been a drafter of international WTO law on behalf of Government of India. I used to find that India would shy away from accepting to draft the negotiating documents or any piece of regulation. Whereas I think that how it develops the legal mind is phenomenal, because you have to learn what are the commercial underpinnings of that particular law. You have to learn about issues like privacy, about all the other attendant factors or conditionalities that have to be kept in mind, the state versus the central positions, how it matches with the constitution, how it matches, correlates with other laws in the country, because it's not an absolute law that you are putting in place or a regulation. And also finally, on how easy will it be to implement, and the implementation is easy read, easy for the courts to handle as well, so that we don't have a very strong need for litigation. So, the words that are put in should be, you have to balance the interests. So there is always a nuance or a balance of interests that guides us when we are drafting law or regulation, but there should not be ambiguity in it, or it should be easy to provide basis for the judiciary to interpret it, seeing the circumstances of that particular consumer. Is it a small scale consumer? Is it large scale consumer? Is it who is it? So I don't want to tell you, I'm sure your teachers and your professors are already telling you all this, but I'm just saying it from the point of, so I used to always tell them, let me draft it. And, I could therefore go from a position of strength, simply because India is a whole mishran of a developed world and a developing world. As people keep saying that you have a poor India and you have a rich India. So you have everybody. You need to take care of the interests of the large corporate. You have to take care of the interests of the small and the informal sector as well. When we're drafting something or providing rules, you have to take care of our small farmers. You have to take care of our large plantation crops as well. So, you know best how to put the issue down so that the interests are met. And very surprisingly, I used to find that most of the developing countries used to tell me, we are very happy that you are drafting it because we know large and small, island economies, small economies, bigger ones, South Africa, Brazil, they would all, sort of say, no, it's good if you're drafting it. You will put a balanced perspective to the draft. And negotiation used to be very easy on it thereafter. So Neha spoke about the value proposition for aircraft financing and leasing. That was, again, an example of how we first, so I wanted to bring the whole issue of large mobile equipment or assets which are amenable to leasing to India. But in the law, because we were a little unsure as to how it would go, and you always do building blocks. So we first went with the aircraft leasing ecosystem, and subsequently I have chaired the committee for ship acquisition, leasing, and financing as well, so that out of the IFSC gift city, the ecosystem is one which is compelling for all large mobile assets, which are bankable and which are amenable to leasing. So that could be your metros, could be the next railways, the engines, the bogies, etc., satellites, you name it. I mean, any large asset could be taken up in the gift city. That's the intention. And the 7th January 2022 notification that Finance Ministry has kindly come out with after our recommendations were made in November last year is aimed at that. So the IFSC authority now has the ability to declare which are the equipment and the associated simulators, etc., accessories, which are to be called a financial product, so that they come within the ambit of the IFSC. So that's something. I just want to, before I go further on, I forgot I needed to touch a little bit the importance of human resources. I cannot tell you how important that is. Indians, I find, after having lived abroad and worked abroad for such a long period, we love to do kunji reading. Our entire approach is driven with shortcuts. Ek koi kunji bata do, usse pad lenge, because we just need to read what is sufficient. Even in the 12th standard, when I was in London, per subject, I used to be given a reading list of at least 100. So for maths, 100, physics, 100, XYZ, 100, minimum. And we had to know them because there were no choices. You didn't get too many choices in answering questions. You had multiple choice questions. You had short answer questions in separate question papers. You had essay types, and then you had your research questions. So every subject had that. And that's how you hone the mind to look at any complex issue and then find solutions. I like to think that I think on my feet, and the varied subjects that I have dealt in the government of India in my entire career. I can't claim to be an expert on aviation, but I spent 4 years and I tried to come out with at least 5 new initiatives. I'll tell you about the others. So one was aircraft leasing and financing. The second was the MRO policy. The third was the air cargo policy. Then on vaccine, I'll talk about the crisis management and the heading of the emergency supplies and vaccine movement, the crisis management we did. I also worked on airport financing, which is something different. So, I would urge all of you, build your foundation well and know much more than what anybody else does and put it to good use. The devil lies in the detail. And as lawyers, you would already be very familiar with. So your the aviation education and skill building that we adopted in Ministry of Civil Aviation, it was precisely to lay a strong foundation with an inclusive approach. So you have the National Civil Aviation Policy 2016, which sets out a comprehensive roadmap for providing skills needed by India's surging aviation sector. And this is through PSU managed training institutes, which already have a strong skilling ethos, like Air India and its Airports Authority of India and its bodies, etc. Pavan Hans Limited is another example. Then Aviation University, Amber has spoken about, but there are also other state-of-the-art aviation-related educational institutes, and I'm happy to learn that you all are bringing in specific courses as well on aviation. Then you have your flying training organizations, which take care of not just the commercial pilot licenses, the airline transport pilot licenses. You have the aviation maintenance engineer, AME institutes, which take care of the AME licenses and so on. Then you also have for security, the BCAS accredited aviation security training institutes. You have the air traffic control officers, the CNS engineers, the airport operators, the fire personnel training. And we also have multi-skill development centers. And at the other end, we are trying to ensure that India's skilling footprint is much higher than what it was earlier. Otherwise, you would have heard about Indians going abroad for skilling and so on. The curriculum has been standardized, the QP have been worked out, qualification packs and national occupational standards for bulk of the levels 1 to 10 for different types of skills that are required. But much more needs to be done. For instance, we don't have sufficient participation of industry in skilling, although they are the ones that are most benefited by it. So industry does need to go and do more. Academia needs to do much more in determining the qualification packs and the skilling curriculums. The engagement has to be much more. Otherwise, you're just leaving it to very many. I'll give you a very cute example. We were doing a quality check on a draft curriculum for a cargo course, cargo security handling course. And when we asked obviously we asked different airlines also to send their personnel. We were sent somebody who was doing the ticket reservations. Now, how would a person who's doing ticket reservations be able to provide quality inputs in drafting a curriculum? So obviously, I blew my top and we finally had to reschedule and we got the right person. But we need to recognize our sense of responsibility to developing these at levels which are high tech. India has played around at the lower levels for far too long, and I think it's time for us to provide our space in the sun. On the ecosystem, I have already spoken about, I don't know whether you need the numbers, how many MROs there are, how many scheduled operators there are, how many airports are operational and all that. I think that is something that can be taken up in question answers in case you do wish to. How much time is left? Because I would like question answers as well.
Ma'am, we have questions. We can do another 10 to 12 minutes for this session. So if you want to take questions, we can take questions also.
Okay, so just first, let me very quickly run through some of the drivers and some of the other things on the aircraft leasing system, which is as you know, one of my favorite subjects at the moment. Let me take you down another track, actually. How do you measure? So I told you that we had a very low penetration and we were starting from a very low foundation, as if you look at when the sector was to take off. How do you judge that in the years of growth, unprecedented growth that we saw from 2014-15 onwards, double-digit growth, 20% plus growth in PAX traffic. Cargo went into double-digit growth as well, which was unprecedented again. How do you measure that, yes, you're on the right track? So it's, fortunately or unfortunately, this crisis management of COVID and the response of COVID is a great measure. So the aviation sector, which was actually the worst hurt because there was a complete shutdown, there were no packs which were allowed to move. But cargo needed to move because I coined the phrase, let's run air trucks, because that's the safest way during the first lockdown to provide all essential services. I'm sure all of you would have found that you were not lacking for essentials, whether it's toothpaste, toothbrush, your soap, your milk, your vegetables, the atta, dal, chawal, gehu, aloo, pyaj, everything was being delivered. How was it being done? There was a huge coordination. So air took off first with air cargo because all these were perishables, milk, etc. We took concentrated milk, but we worked with post office and used the post office vans to deliver milk because they were easily identified, and at the check nakas and all these could be allowed to go through. So there was a huge amount of response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So where aviation played such a pivotal role in unhindered and timely air transportation, after ensuring that all the COVID-19 safety protocols are followed. So this is so important. Keeping safety in view, everything was done. People in need and essential service providers, they were being moved through Vande Bharat mission, air bubbles. There was calibrated domestic operations, opening of the sector in a calibrated manner. Then on cargo, as I said, temperature controlled, daily transport of vaccines, both domestic and international. India is a case study. There's a BBC documentary also on how, without spending on cold chain infrastructure, which everybody was telling me, develop karo. I said, nahi chahiye. We can't handle -70 at our nurses in some Leh Ladakh or in Andaman Nicobar Island. How will we open them? Kaun dega? Within half a second, 1 second, you have to administer the injection. So, all that was very difficult. So we worked with easy systems, but not a single mishap. Have you heard of anything? Shortage of vaccine or any mishap? No, simply because we could manage the temperature control daily movement very well. Then we did facilitated air cargo. So initially, PPE kits chahiye, gloves chahiye, medicines chahiye, the active ingredient APIs chahiye hote hain to make the medicines, because it's not just the vaccine that's needed. You needed so many other medicines, not just for the vaccine COVID-related disease, but also for heart patients, for diabetic patients, and so on and so forth. So all that had to continue. So we did Lifeline Udan, we did Krishi Udan, we did materials for industry, because everything has to move. All that by air, we did very well. And kudos to the aviation personnel. Apni jaan ko jokhim mein dal ke, we used to get so many volunteers saying, I'm ready for it. When India did the first evacuation out of Wuhan, Air India just jumped, and the senior most commanders are telling us, we want to pilot that plane, etc. So it was fabulous. We did so much of evacuation, not just of Indians, but of non-Indians as well, from the worst hit places. And it was done very successfully. Then we prioritized the ferrying of critical medical equipment. Aapko last year ka oxygen containers, concentrators, generators, ventilators, and all that. So we were at the front end doing that. Then we needed to provide air navigation, airport facilitation, customs and regulatory authorities के साथ मिलकर सब बैठ के करते थे. So, you know, all this was done as a part of the response. It's not been documented, but this is a story which India succeeded. Our vaccine Maitri succeeded despite all the, you know, local brouhaha which we keep having with the naysayers and all that. We did very important policy interventions for rapid clearances and for logistics facilitation at all airports. We waived cargo terminal charges by I-class or the public sector. Obviously, we can't, you know, the freebie regime cannot work at all times. So we were very measured in that. All the safety protocols I've already mentioned, cargo flights, etc. And then, of course, the vaccine drive. So whichever way you look at it, this fabulous response in crisis when everybody is at sea shows how well the aviation sector has grown, and it has been buttressed over the years of dedicated policy interventions, lawmaking, and so on. Now, if I were to just turn very quickly to rupee raftar, we had realized that, so where did we get this thought? The leasing cost or the aircraft cost was such a high element of the passenger tickets or the freight ticket that when I started looking at it as to what it was on a comparative basis with other countries, I found that India's lease loads or the lease factor was much higher even in the case of our best airlines as compared to the world's best airlines. And so we needed to bring down the costs, and we needed to put in a system which gave us Atmanirbharta as well when we looked at it. So it was an opportunity whose time had come. And the development since then shows that, you know, frankly, the leasing future is here in IFSC Gift City, and we can all work in the happy notion that we can make India the next aviation hub, and to give it, you know, it's already one of the top 3 aviation markets after US and China. And there was a need for in-house lessors as well. So we began to work on it. We already had a very large aircraft order book. The growth of air traffic was already there. We had the 3rd largest aircraft order book after China and US. And we were all set to grow. The revenue potential was enormous. And the commercial jet backlog we had estimated in the committee was about US dollars 19.32 billion. So if you want to see, that is the kind of numbers we could use to convince the government that it can make its investment in setting up an aviation leasing hub at IFSC Gift City. Is there, so the value proposition, as I called it, we put it in order. We did minimalist but changes in taxes. You know, everybody loved to tell us from the very first go, make all taxes zero. Singapore mein ye zero hai, Dubai mein ye zero hai, Hong Kong mein ye zero hai. So we said you can't do forum shopping, but let's work out what is the overall competitiveness of, including tax competitiveness overall, of the IFSC Gift Center. And we ensured that the direct tax changes and the indirect tax changes were sufficient to give India at least a 2 to 3% advantage over the best, which was Ireland. Okay, the most competitive nation, which was Ireland, and the others as well. So we put in the system, and I'm very happy to say that, you know, the report was submitted on 10th of January 2019. On 1st of February 2019, the Honorable Finance Minister already announced that India will accept and go for recommendations, study the recommendations and give effect to it. A high-level committee was set up under the Civil Aviation Secretary and the Secretary Finance, the DEA Secretary. And the changes were given effect to. So within a period of 6 months to 8 months, the essential changes had already been made. And within a year of this initiative, we already had the first aircraft come in from Gift City on lease basis in July 2021. So you can see how fast the whole thing moved, despite the COVID, despite everything else. So there are some things that I wanted to talk about, such as the importance of the Cape Town Convention and what all we need to do. But on the way forward, I will just give you that even as far as leasing is concerned, what are the actions which are currently going on? One, that the Cape Town Convention and the protocol provisions are to be enacted in domestic law shortly. Of course, we've created the platform for aircraft leasing and financing at IFSC. So now what else needs to be done? We're working on an online national registry of aircraft, engines, and any other lease parts. This will be the first in the world to be set up. And we are in the process of, setting up an online financing platform for the smaller aircraft as well. What do I mean by that? Banks usually don't look at taking assets on mortgage or having a lien on them if they are 5 crore ka hai, 10 crore ka hai. Till you talk to them about 50 crores and more, they chaff at providing financing. So we have come out with a innovative financing platform so that the small jets, the helicopters, etc., which are valued at say up to 10 crores per aircraft, those can be brought into India. So these are some of the important steps going forward.